Today's gospel lesson is actually 3 wisdom sayings put together. Wisdom sayings are filled with wisdom, and they are meant to be visited and revisited again and again and again because they defy easy understanding. You might have listened to these yet again and found yourself going along with a particular image in your head, all of a sudden to have it twisted, or something new interjected that threw you for a loop, or at least halted the image that you had in your mind. We can read these 3 wisdom sayings and consider how they reflect the end times, right? In fact, the hymn that we sang right before the gospel is a whole nother story. It's actually a story, a parable, that talks about those that have their lamps, some which are lit and some which are not, some who have prepared with oil and a long enough wick, and others who haven't prepared. And so we could read these wisdom sayings with an opportunity to reflect on the end times, and that would be an honest way to reflect on these pieces, on these teachings. But it's not the sum total of their value. Another way we can look at these is to focus on their instruction for the unforeseen time and space after what we know, acknowledging that we don't know everything, that our minds are finite, our understanding is finite. It usually follows building upon what we've known before. We can look at these lessons and teachings and say, we know that we want the best for whatever comes after now, even if we don't know what it is. We want it to be good. I saw a meme on someone's Facebook of a sign outside of a storefront that said, with those letters that you can change, that just sits on the sidewalk. And it said, I've got to change my life because I am not going to hell. After noticing the heat of all of this, saying, I don't want more of this, right? So we could read these particular passages of teaching and look at them from that perspective. We can read these wisdom sayings literally and consider how they directly relate to our lives. When you talk about do not put your money where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, we can think, what is consumed by moths? What is consumed by rust? What can be stolen? How much have I invested of myself into these things? But there's something about these wisdom sayings that can seem burdensome when we approach them in this way, judgmental, perhaps even accusatory. Sometimes people can engage a wisdom saying, and by its confusion or their experience of confusion, they can feel that they're set up for failure. And so we don't always like to engage wisdom sayings. So I don't really know what that means, and I don't know how to think about it, and so let's go on. I want us to consider how wisdom sayings are meant to be guides. They're not meant to be guilting. All of wisdom is meant to give us some guidance in our lives, invite us into deeper reflection from what we obviously see and the conclusions that we draw by that which is evident in front of us. Wisdom sayings are timeless, and that's the beauty of them. These things are so old, and yet they can have applicability in our own day. So I want, in an effort to reflect on these yet again, I want to direct your attention to your own life when we think about wisdom sayings as guides. I want to direct your attention to your own life to help open up these wisdom sayings. And we're going to work with the first one. The very first one. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You're so familiar with this saying. There are parts of it that you could take out and repeat to anyone on various occasions. And maybe when you reflect on your own life, having heard this perhaps in relationship to stewardship season and how it is that you need to give more, or even the line about where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so perhaps you've been invited to look at your checkbook to see where your heart is. And I think that that's a nice reflection. Not for the sake of tithing, but for the sake of clarity and reflection. Where do you spend your money? What do you spend it on? Food, which is taking up a lot more of money right now. Shelter, we all need that. And yes, rust does consume it. Transportation, rust consumes that. Clothing, moths are real. They consume that. But we need these things, food and shelter and clothing. So how can we feel badly about the thing that we need? But I would guess that most of your money, or at least when you have the chance to make a choice, you spend it on things that moths and rust do not consume. You spend it on things that thieves will not break in and steal. You spend it on experiences with your family or friends. You spend it on education. You spend it on other people. You spend it on your health. You probably give money away to people in need. Reflecting all this, then we might be tempted to think that we've got this wisdom saying down pat and we can leave it alone. I want to reflect, though, that where we put our money is usually in relationship to relationship. It's the relationships that motivate us. We have food for those we love because we love them. We have shelter with those we love because we want to be in the same shelter as them. We consider what kind of transportation will get us there well because of our commitment and engagement with the world. The experiences, the education, healthcare, these are all things we spend on people that we love. It's actually the relationships that motivate us. We aren't trying to store up for ourselves some type of security in this world, at least not the kind that moth or rust consume, or thieves break in and steal. It's relationship that motivates us, and it's relationship that we're invited into as Christian people. This is what we're called into in faith. Through our faith, we're called into relationship. And I would actually go so far as to say that faith is what emerges in relationship. In your closest relationships, you have faith in one another. You begin to count on one another for those things that you cannot see, that you're unaware of. The future, you begin to count on each other because you're in relationship. Like hope and love, faith doesn't exist in any form on its own. It's what emerges in between two people. Faith, hope, and love, they grow in relationship. When we look at the Old Testament lesson for today, we see that Abram believed the Lord. Now, when you heard this read by Denise, what kind of images came to your mind? It says at the very beginning that it was a vision, but as it moves along, I find myself seeing it much more as one created being beside another. Especially when it says, he brought him outside and said. I'm imagining this late night conversation of who is to be my heir. I have no offspring of my own. This is the kind of reflection that happens at 2 or 3 in the morning. These are the kind of thoughts that pop up when you're relaxed and your deepest questions come to your attention. And so it says that it started out as a vision, but then when it says he brought him outside, I'm thinking, how did he bring him outside? And in my mind's eye, I see one get up and open the door. I see one put one's hand on Abram's shoulder and take him out. I see one put one's arm around Abram's shoulder and point up and say, see, look toward heaven. That's what appears in my mind. And it says that Abram believed the Lord and that the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Abram had faith in the Lord's word to him because he had a relationship with the God beyond all time and space. When we reflect on Abram's story, we can see all of the reasonable ways that he would not believe him. Really, there's a long list. Time and again in this epic story, we see why Abram should say, this is really not going to happen. I don't know why I set my sights on this. I need to give up on this hope that I've been having. This is ridiculous. We know throughout the scriptures that those who have attuned their ear to God's voice within themselves have been found, a little crazy. In fact, St. Paul says, whether out of the body or in the body, I don't know. It is something, though, this relationship, and Jesus incarnates this in our midst and draws us further into believing its reality. The other lesson that was appointed for today is from Paul's letter to the Hebrews. that one who encountered the risen Lord and was blinded by him. Another epic story that changed his life forever and infused within him this real connection with a God that's beyond all time and space. He writes in his letter to the Hebrews, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen." And so we might think of faith as something we're supposed to somehow try to capture, but when we understand it as something that emerges from relationship and how it is that you have faith in your friends and family, then we begin to see, oh yes, this is the assurance of things hoped for. That you will love me into the future, that you will forgive me even when I wrong you. It doesn't mean I'm going to try to wrong you. I just have trust and faith that you will stay with me. Faith is something that emerges from relationship. In Hebrews, this passage and next week the same emphasis is on faith. And it is in this portion of Hebrews that Paul reminds his listeners, which were the children of Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he stayed in that for a time in the land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city that was his foundation, that has foundations, whose architecture and builder is God. By faith, he received power of procreation, even though he was too old. There's reasonable reason number one. And Sarah herself was barren. There's another reason this shouldn't work. Because he considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one person, and this one as good as dead, descendants were born, quote, as many as the stars of heaven and as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. That's a quote from a psalm. So faith is what emerges from our relationship with God, and I believe that that's something that we can be encouraged then when we come to the wisdom sayings for today. In the particular one that we're looking at, where Jesus says, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Here it is that Jesus is calling these disciples, all who will listen, to consider God as Father, a relationship that we have some awareness of, no matter its perfection. We understand relationship through generations. And it is in thinking of relationships that we have faith that something will happen, that we have the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. I acknowledge that over these last 2.5 years, faith has been tried. We will talk now more openly about a lack of faith. Perhaps a lack of faith in our democratic society and the system of governance. Maybe a lack of faith in changing some of the systemic oppressions that are built into our laws. A lack of faith, perhaps, that poverty will ever be dwindled down to something that is of such small percentage that anyone can emerge from it. I think this lack of faith is calling us, if we're open, into new relationships with these topics. We've come to conclusions based on what we have known and experienced in the past. And the more that we know and reflect on what we've known and experienced, the more we can understand how it is that our relationships continue in that same way. And what we need now are new relationships so that faith can emerge. This is why I cried so hard a few weeks back after all of those decisions that came down from the Supreme Court. Not because I was surprised by them, but because I was struck by how little connection we have with one another for faith to grow in new ways. There's a lot of work ahead of us, and it can feel overwhelming, and we might feel tempted to crawl back into some familiar little a happy spot so that we can find some feeling that we associate as peace. But I think this uncomfortable and restless place, this spot where we say there is no faith, is actually God's invitation for us to do things differently so that faith can emerge. And we can do that with both God and neighbor. So as I bring this to a close, I want to emphasize both those pieces and give you some things to reflect on about how it is that we can grow in faith with both God and our neighbor. With God, it is about reconsidering if we have tapped into all the ways to be in relationship with God. Indeed, when churches closed down and we had to figure out how to connect online, we started to wonder, whoa, where is God in all of this? When we couldn't come into this familiar space that brings us to a place of prayer. When we couldn't engage in the sacraments that by their taste and feel, they bring us to a place of prayer. When we couldn't hear each other's voices that could help us find ourselves in Christian community, and thus we were lost. We had to consider, where is God now? How do I have a relationship with God now? I found myself going back to people who have died in the faith and who lived during difficult times. I started to read St. Augustine's sermons on the Gospel of John, my favorite gospel. Now, Augustine lived at the end of the 300s. It's a long time ago. And to read his writings, he was preaching to people who were illiterate. He was preaching in a space that had no amplification. If he was to get anywhere, he had to go with the power of an animal, even if there were wheels. He had to write everything down. He didn't type it and save it. There was a lot of inefficiencies in the way that had to be lived then. He was fighting a heresy, Donatism. The Donatists believed that the clergy all needed to be pure in order for the sacraments to be valid. And on its face, that might seem like a noble invitation to live a pure life. But when you dig a little deeper, then you realize that the movement of the Spirit is at the mercy of our perfection. And we know that the Spirit of God is bigger than our fallibility. So to read this guy's words and his words about who God is way back when now could not even be imagined was restorative to me. To read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's words in a time where there was political unrest and there was oppression and there was violence, that was restorative to me. I started to see God in ways I hadn't seen God before, and the mystics could do this as well. Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, St. John of the Cross, St. Ignatius of Loyola. These people lived hard and difficult lives, and God was real. And so I came alongside of these friends to find God in a new way. And in that, I found that God was not bound by the chaos and anxiety of this present moment. And in that, I found faith. So it is when we come into a deeper study of Scripture, that when we come into meditation and contemplation and prayer, when we come into Christian community for reflection, beyond what we have already known, we begin to discover God in new ways. And faith returns. This is true also of our neighbor. As I mentioned, coming into Christian community to be connected with one another. Indeed, Dietrich Bonhoeffer became my friend who I visited with every morning. And St. Augustine became a very surprising friend to me. They became my neighbors when I couldn't be close to you. As we become more familiar and in connection with one another, we will see our faith grow. It is true that there are divisions in all sorts of ways among humanity, and the only way for faith to emerge is for us to learn to come in relationship with one another and watch it be given to us in relationship with one another. Across generations, across socioeconomic identities, across racial identities or ethnic identities. It's when we come into our shared humanity that then we see our faith restored, not because we brought it along, but because that's what God gave us in that connection. This month of August is an opportunity to lay the groundwork for the fall. And as much as we are able, the leadership is wanting to be in conversation with you to test out some of our ideas of ways to draw us into community, into Christian community, where we have the chance to know one another better and where we have the chance to receive the faith that we need, that only God can give. And so I hope that you'll be quick to offer your thoughts and feedback. We are going to throw out all kinds of things, and we want to see if you are willing to alter your schedule in whatever way to come together and be in relationship with one another. And it will be helpful if we hear your words as much as your actions. Because what we ultimately want to do is give God an opportunity to restore our faith in God's creation, restore our faith in humanity, which God continues to have faith in. Because it is God who loved us first. It is God who created us and who calls us to be his people. And so with God's help, we might discover that God has all that we need and is ready to give it. Amen.